I do want to welcome everyone. I would like to say how I became acquainted with Fabrice. And I, by the way, will have to ask Fabrice to give his own biography because it's so extensive, I'll never be able to do it justice. But so I learned about Fabrice through my volunteer work in the Private Directors Association. And so I'm on the cybersecurity committee of the Private Directors Association. And I'm also on their diversity, equity, and inclusion committee as a member of the LGBTQ community. And I wanted to increase our involvement with the LGBTQ community because we promote membership on boards. And we saw Fabrice's name, and I'm so delighted that when I reached out to Fabrice on LinkedIn, and I can't remember how many tens of thousands of followers he has, so I thought my name would never surface in his LinkedIn messaging. I thought I just would never appear, but he responded, and I'm so happy he did. And I invited Fabrice to facilitate a conversation today about LGBTQ membership and involvement on boards of directors. And probably some of you are people I'd love to feature in our webinar series. So please keep in touch. I'll put my contact information in the chat feature. So Fabrice, it's to you. Please tell us about you because your credential list is so long, I would not know where to start.
Well, thank you so much, John. And I think you're being very humble when you say that you were afraid I was not going to respond, because I'm extremely interested in John bringing a lens to our work, which is the lens of private director opportunities, because of the fact that naturally our association focused a lot on public board at the beginning, and I think we really want to extend our knowledge in that area, and John has been helping us, and I'll speak to that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself because I'm allowed to give myself an introduction, and I'm very happy about it because there is nothing I love more than to talk about myself. But maybe I'll give you a little introduction to my story through the lens of how I ended up leading this specific nonprofit, which is that I didn't know anything about corporate governance until very recently. I'm a civil servant. I work at the World Bank for 14 years. And towards the end of my career, maybe the last 6 or 7 years, I was very interested in the interconnection between development and LGBTQ issues. This idea that LGBTQ plus people have a different experience of the development effort, the global development efforts, because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. And as you can imagine, that was not a very popular agenda at the World Bank. You know, the World Bank response was pretty much to say, look, we are a serious organization in the business of reducing poverty, and you're coming to talk to us about sexuality. That undermines our reputation. So, my idea is that maybe some of our clients were gay or trans people, and that they might be overrepresented among the poorest, was not received super well. But I did manage to make a little bit of inroads at the World Bank, and that led me to leave the World Bank in 2016, and I moved to New York to work for the United Nations and for the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights. And maybe at that point, for the first time, I started looking a little bit at the private sector. And the reason is because the private sector was perceived sometimes as a more neutral voice than the United Nations when it came to LGBTQ plus issues. So I co-wrote, when I was in the Office of the High Commissioner, I co-wrote the United Nations Global Corporate LGBTQ plus Standards of Conduct. And that's a document that is part of the Human Rights Framework that basically translates the United Nations guidelines on business and human rights for private companies. So in that process, I kind of realized that the private sector had huge sway when it comes to the socioeconomic outcomes of LGBTQ plus people. And so eventually I decided to escape the UN system after almost 20 years there. And I managed to weasel my way into getting a green card. And so finally I could do whatever I wanted. In fact, I weaseled my way first in getting a visa. So after I get my visa in 2020, I work a tiny bit for a think tank on doing exactly what I did at the United Nations, which was trying to get very large company to play a role in fostering social change abroad, whether it was marriage equality in Japan or decriminalization in the Caribbean. Whenever the private sector had some opportunity to contribute to the efforts, I would try to leverage it. But in my purview, I had a small initiative on board diversity. And at that point, I didn't know anything about the board. I was not super interested, to be honest with you. And I was slightly annoyed that I had to work on board diversity. And, I'm going to actually share my screen a minute so you can see a little bit my background, if you don't mind. So that's me. The reason I'm showing you that annoying slide is to tell you that I was also very engaged in a non-profit organization, that were working on LGBTQ plus right at the time. And so I didn't pay too much attention to the initiative. And then Goldman Sachs, sorry, that's a confusion they would not be very happy about. Goldman Sachs said, no IPO without diverse board member, including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And that was kind of revolutionary because up to that point, board diversity had been understood as being gender primarily. And God knows we still have a long way to go in the United States in that area. And then racial and ethnic underrepresentation. Black people still have very few board seats. Latino represent 40% of population in California. I think they have 4% of board seats. So two areas in which the United States has made some progress, but not gigantic progress. And then for the first time, they said, look, sexual orientation and gender identity too. So look, it was not a gigantic development, but it perked a little bit my interest. And then a few months later, California passed a law called AB 979. And AB 979 mandated disclosure of board diversity on the basis of gender, racial background, but also sexual orientation, gender identity. And then a year later, NASDAQ, completely out of the blue, said that companies that were listed on the exchange would have to disclose what was the composition of their board, and sexual orientation and gender identity were included. And, I say completely out of the blue because no LGBTQ plus organization was consulted. It came as a surprise. In fact, we tend to prefer when disclosure is nominative, and NASDAQ went with non-nominative disclosure, meaning that you have a matrix that say, well, look, I have 2 LGBTQ plus people, but it won't say who it is, and so it would lead to the first fun stories I will tell you, which is that I have two little boys that are 11 years old, and a few months ago, one of my sons was looking at me on the couch, and I was looking at a bunch of pictures, and he said, "What are you doing, Papa?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to figure out who is a gay person on that board." And my son said, "You can do that by looking at pictures?" And I was like, "Yeah, that's one of Papa's superpower, that I can look at people's picture and figure out who is gay and who isn't." Which, by the way, is much more complex than it looks, and very often I didn't manage to. But the reason I'm telling you that is because of the fact that it's not nominative on NASDAQ, I find myself very often looking at the list of board members and being like, who is the gay person that is in that matrix? And sometimes it's very difficult to figure it out. But so back to my story, there is a guy called Jay Bloom who is very famous in the United States because he defeated affirmative action at the Supreme Court. He's basically a lone wolf supported by a bunch of conservative think tanks that is suing any diversity effort in the United States. And one of the efforts that he focused on was that law in California called AB 979. And so the Department of Justice of California decided that they needed to defend themselves against that lawsuit. And they look for expert witness. And so I became completely unwillingly an expert witness for the Department of Justice in California. So I'll tell you so that if that happens to you one day, you should definitely get paid. I didn't ask for any money, and I had no idea how much work it would be. I thought I would be. It would take me 3 hours of my time, and I would be done. It basically took a year, and so I would have those calls with the Department of Justice because they cannot write the opinion for you. You know what I mean? You have to write it, but they help guide you because, of course, I have no judicial knowledge. I mean, no law knowledge besides having watched Legally Blonde a few times. So I needed the help, but mostly to be a good expert witness, I had to articulate why I believed LGBTQ plus representation on board mattered, and why I believe LGBTQ plus people are underrepresented, and why I believe the regulator needs to step in. So those are fundamental questions when you look at board diversity. And so I had to kind of scrap my brain and think about issues like, is there an LGBTQ plus voice? And also, why are the reasons why we are underrepresented, and to which extent? So, eventually, AB 979 was defeated. I was supposed to go to court in Los Angeles. I had already picked my outfit. The judge, who was a Reagan-appointed judge, looked at the case. He didn't even look at the expert witness statement. And he said, this is anti-constitutional. The law is over. Now, the good news is because the law had been the law of the land for a little while, it did lead to a change in the mindset of company in California. So that's a big positive. The small positive is that I became very interested in that topic. And as I became very interested in that topic, I realized that all the other minorities, meaning women, Asian Americans, Latino, Blacks, they are not waiting for white straight people to give them board seats. They organize themselves to get board seats. They're like, look, I'm going to make sure that our talent is forefront in the mind of people selecting board member. So we did not have that setup. So eventually I get my green card. The story is that I get those 2 little kids, but I never get married, so I didn't get American citizenship. That will be my second recommendation besides being paid when you do an expert statement, is that when you have children, always get married, and then you can always divorce if it doesn't work. But I didn't get married, so I needed to get a green card. I finally get my green card, and I could do whatever I wanted. So now what I do is that I do a lot of the work I did previously on development and LGBT issues. So I have clients like the Asian Development Bank. I write a lot on the topic. I also teach at Columbia and Georgetown the topic. But I also thought I'm going to help create that nonprofit that will represent the interest of LGBTQ plus people in the boardroom. So in June 2022, I incorporated in Delaware, and then I spent the summer constituting a board. And we have a very prestigious board with people like Betsy Bernard, that used to be the CEO of AT&T and is now on the board of multiple companies, including Zimmer Biomet, which is a Fortune 500. We have Michael Camunez, who is on the board of Edison International. In fact, I'm going to share my screen 1 minute and show you a picture of who our board is, if I find it. I apologize. Wait, it should be somewhere. Yeah, it is. So I'm going to share my screen for a minute so that you can see who I'm talking about. So Michael Camines, I mentioned him. He's on the board of Edison International. Betsy Bernard. Imara Jones is a trans woman. Today there is no trans woman. There's very few trans women in the boardroom. I think the most prominent trans woman in the boardroom is someone called Sue Nabi. She's the CEO of Coty, which is a cosmetics company. She has done a great job. She was interviewed recently, I think in Fortune magazine. But Imara Jones is a trans black woman who is part of our board. Chiki Cartagena, she leads SUNY TV, Latina woman. Richard Socarides, who used to be in the Clinton administration. He was basically the Gexa in the Clinton administration. Heather Hiles, who is on a bunch of boards, including Udemy. Heather Hiles is one of two people that have identified as non-binary in the NASDAQ disclosure. So it's really interesting, you can disclose being non-binary on the NASDAQ, and out of the 3,300 company, and probably the 33,000 board seats on NASDAQ, only two people self-identify as non-binary, and Heather is one of them. Gary Rodriguez works at Edelman and kind of know the governance role. Denise Torres, she's on a bunch of boards too, also Latina. Ozzy Gramada, who is the CEO of the Latino Corporate Director Association, which I'm basically trying to emulate. And then Elizabeth Mora, who is on a bunch of boards, 5 boards, 3 of them in California. So that's a really good group of people. And so once I had that board, we launched officially in September 2022 at JP Morgan headquarters in New York City. And then I had to figure out what we were going to do, because once you have launched the organization, you have to carry out activities. And so we do a bunch of different things. One thing we do is networking, because it's extremely important to understand that one of the reasons LGBTQ plus people are underrepresented in the boardroom is because we live a little bit at the margin of the informal networks that feed into the boardroom. So I love to caricature it in a ridiculous way. And I always say, look, gay people do not vacation in Martha's Vineyard. They go to Provincetown or Fire Island, right? That's a caricature. That's not the case. Lesbians go everywhere where there's good food. But that's basically a caricature of this idea that where you socialize is very important. And then the other reason is that I say that gay people are not on the board of the PGA. And of course, not all members of the Fortune 100 boards come from the board of the PGA, but there is a huge correlation with being on the board of a school, as an example, being on the board of a big museum, being on the board of a big sport organization, and being on the board of a Fortune 100. So, there's no causality, because of course, if you have money, chances are you are at the top of business, and your school asks you to be on that board. But also something that happens is that if you are on the board of Stanford, the people that have a board will see you acting in a governance capacity. And then they are more willing to tap you to join their board. So all those very, informal ways kind of feed into the board, and LGBT people live a little bit at the margin of that ecosystem. So networking is a way to also benefit from our informal network. So of course, networking between gay people is important, but also networking with straight people that have the board seats are important. And so there is nothing I love more than when straight people come to our events. And I'll tell you something interesting is that, we have very good straight allies. There's a woman called Alicia Siret. She's the chair of DG Mark. She comes to a lot of our events. Recently there is a great woman called Jocelyn Moore, who is on the board of Bally's. She came to our woman dinner. There's nothing I love more than when straight women express interest in our effort to increase diversity. It's very rare that straight men want to spend time at an LGBTQ plus board of directors dinner. I think there's still a little bit of fear that if they show up, people might assume that they are gay. And so, I get straight women to participate in our event. I get a little less straight men, but there are some straight men, usually in the governance ecosystem, that join us. So all that to tell you that it's not enough to create this informal network within the gay community. The goal is to create informal network that tap into other networks. So one way we do that is that we are spending a lot of time at the National Association of Corporate Directors. So I encourage a lot of my members, either existing director or aspiring director, to go to the various events of the NASDQ chapters or to go to the annual conference. And it's not the easiest thing, because you get into that room of people that have known each other for 10 years, that socialize with each other, that maybe their kids have known each other, right? And so they're very happy to be back together and sit around the table. And sometimes the gay people that are in that room, they still have a little bit of difficulties to find a topic of conversation to bond. And so one way we have solved it is that every year we give a big dinner hosted by the LGBT Association. It's a lot of fun. It's probably the best event, of course, of the entire NASDQ, because gay people know how to throw an event. And in fact, last year, the former CEO of United, Oscar Munoz, came to the dinner. He's a straight man. And then he went on stage at NASDQ the following day, and we were very happy because he said, look, that's an aspect of diversity we didn't look at, and that's something we have to look at. But the idea is to tell LGBTQ plus people, don't self-exclude from the places where board opportunities are appearing. If you don't engage, those places are always going to be kind of, not very aware of LGBTQ plus people, and also there's not going to be progress. So we try to, and NASDQ has been very welcoming over time of LGBTQ plus people. But that's something where a lot of my candidates, even people that are very good position in boards, would not go because they would not feel very comfortable. That issue of comfort is extremely important, and it's very difficult to explain to people. And I'll tell you something, which is, I was talking to a lesbian recently who told me that when she goes to the board dinner, the board dinner is the most important aspect of the boardroom, which is the day before the board meeting, you have a dinner. And that's a very socializing aspect. Maybe you talk a little bit about business, but mostly it's an opportunity to see each other before you get to business. And so this woman tells me, she says, look, every time I'm going to go to my board meeting, I read the sports pages so that I know a little bit which team has won what, so that I can participate in the conversation. And it really struck me because, I have no interest whatsoever in baseball or football. And I would be, if I was in a conversation that was discussing what the Yankees or the Buffaloes, I don't know, whatever name those teams have, I would be completely lost. Even sometimes my son is interested in baseball, and I took him to the stadium to see the Yankees, and I just opened my newspaper after 10 minutes. I was like, this is the most boring thing I've ever seen in my life. So what I mean is that even though this is very subtle to explain, your centers of interest affect your ability to be part of the group in the boardroom. And that's really interesting, because very often when I think about resistance to diversity, I don't really think about it as being malicious. I think about it, the fact that if you are in a group that is working well and you are having a good time, you don't want to invite to the dinner someone who is going to be disruptive, or is not really part of the group, or is going to make the atmosphere awkward. And so sometimes when you hear someone says, well, look, he's not a good fit for the board culture, what they really mean is going to make our dinner awkward. I mean, they don't really think that way, but this is what is really going on through their mind. And so, we have to create an appetite for that diversity, but also but also explain that not all gay people are going to come to the board meeting to talk about knitting or sequins dresses, that some of them actually have interests that overlap interests of straight people. And, that's why visibility is extremely important, because people have an image of LGBT board member as being unqualified and unneeded. And so every time I have the opportunity to say, no, 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 you've been in the boardroom with Jim Fitterling, you've been in the boardroom with Beth Ford, you've been in the boardroom with Myrna Soto, you've been in the boardroom with Rita Lane, and you have loved her and her contribution, and you have always seen them as being part of your board. We are not talking about unqualified and needed people. We are talking about a huge pool of talent that is living a little bit outside of the ecosystem. And I talked to you a little earlier about the bottleneck, the network bottlenecks. But I would like to talk to you about another bottleneck that is important to think about, which is that LGBTQ plus people typically had difficulties in that specific generation. Right? We're talking about a generation that goes probably from 50 to 75 years old. That specific generation had a huge experience of homophobia and transphobia in business. If they made it to the top, chances are they needed to be in the closet. Today, we have 3 CEOs of Fortune 500 companies that are LGBT. So I think that's 0.6%. One is Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, very famous. One is Jim Fitterling, CEO of Dow Chemicals, a brilliant guy. And then one is Beth Ford, CEO of Land O'Lakes, also amazing. Tim Cook came out under duress in his mid-50s. Jim Fitterling came out at 54 publicly after a cancer scare. He loves to talk about the fact that he thought having to hide his true self took a toll on his health. And he was like, that's it. And, I'm going to be out. What I mean by that is that a lot of my candidates have had to navigate extremely homophobic environment. And so a lot of them didn't make it to the top of business, but also a lot of the ones that made it to the top of business were a little bit invisible. And so that plays a role too, right? But perhaps more importantly, and sadly, a lot of the men that should be today in the boardroom, the gay men, died of HIV. So you have an entire generation of people that should be in the boardroom that doesn't exist. And if you are not in the boardroom, you are not in the boardroom, right? Because your friends are the ones that are the most likely to tap you to be in the boardroom. And if those people have died of HIV, you're really out of luck in getting a board seat. So, it's very difficult to explain that to straight people as being an element that explains our diversity. And then there is a third element that to me is crucial and completely unspoken about, is that there is still a level of prejudice. So what I mean by that is that nobody says, I don't want to die or fag in my boardroom. We're in 2024. Nobody says that. But what they think is that if you are gay, you have broken social rules. You have broken, perhaps you have broken the law at some point, but you have also broken, unwritten social rules. And so what you have to understand is that being in the boardroom is based on trust and is based on conformity to rules. The idea is that you are someone that is not respecting societal rules makes you a little more suspicious. And so, people are never going to say, well, I don't want him because they are gay, but they're maybe going to have that perception that that person is less trustworthy, or that person is less equipped for fiduciary responsibilities. And of course, that's extremely difficult to explain. So that last element, I talk a lot about the network element. I talk a lot about the missing generation. I very rarely talk about prejudice. But I think there is still some level of prejudice. And, that's not only the experience of LGBT people. That's also the experience of African American, right? Meaning that very often the discrimination that African American face in the boardroom, when a lot of board members report thinking that diverse candidates are unneeded or unqualified. It's based on prejudice, not based on on real fact, right? Same thing for Latinos, same thing for women. I think women is also extremely striking in the sense that women have been working at diversity for such a long time and have achieved so little. Only 24% of board seats on the NASDAQ are occupied by women. Only 30% of board seats on Fortune 500 are occupied by women. I love to say that in my country, French women would be burning garbage in front of the headquarters of companies that don't have parity, right? Today in Europe, there is a mandate for 40% women representation on board. In France, women represent 44% of board. I mean, the message is very clear when a company like Charter Communications has 16 board members or 15 board members. I would love actually to put in the chat the link to the board of Charter Communication. That's a very big company. They bring Spectrum, which is the internet, to New York City. They bring Spectrum, the internet, to Los Angeles. So that's a company everybody knows. They have one woman in their 15 directors in 2024. The message is very clear. What they are telling us is they said, we have been looking around at those women and we found one of them that was worthy of sitting among us. What it means is that the level of impunity and the lack of appetite for diversity is so real that the charter doesn't make any effort to try to integrate more women on their board. So I love those companies because very often when you go on their website, they are the only companies that doesn't put pictures of the board member. They just put names. So if you go on the website of Charter, there's just a series of names because they know that the picture looks really bad. And yet they don't feel like they should bring at least one other woman on their board, So what I mean by that is that I love to look at the experience of other minority and women to remind myself that there is nothing very specific about the LGBT experience. That question of missing network, that question of suspicion of being unqualified or unneeded, that's something that we all experience. And one of the things that I want to work more on is creating alliances between what we are trying to do and what other minority are trying to do. So anyway, we are almost at the time for the Q&A. I talked to you a lot about our efforts to create those informal networks. Of course, we do much more than that. We do a tiny bit of education, meaning we try to get our board member to think about how do I present my cybersecurity skills? How do I create my narrative for the boardroom? What are the big issues that are coming to face board this year? Sometimes we have people that have obtained their first board seat that come together to talk about their experience, right? So we do a few webinars that are focused on that. We just did one recently on the relationship between the office of the CEO and the boardroom. So it's a wide array of education opportunities. We do a lot of working with intermediaries. Today, recruiters are not super interested in us. And the reason is they will tell you there's no demand for LGBT candidates, which we know. There's nobody today, very rarely, that say, I want an LGBT person. I think it happened twice in the past. One was Grindr. When Grindr went public on the New York Stock Exchange, they needed 6 LGBT board members. And they actually recruited a lot of brilliant LGBT people, like Dan Baer, Megan Stabler with a trans woman. So when they went public on the New York Stock Exchange, they wanted LGBT board member. Scholastic was looking for an LGBT board member. I don't know if they found one, but it's very rare. So recruiters are not super interested. And they also live under the illusion that they know all the LGBT potential board members. Well, I'm always telling them there is an entire pool of talent that is not on your radar screen. So instead, we work a lot with intermediaries, like the New York Stock Exchange, as an example, as a board diversity initiative, in which companies that are going to IPO or companies that are listed on the exchange will approach them and say, do you have a recommendation for a board member? So we work with them. We work with JP Morgan, which has advisory services also for their clients to ensure that LGBTQ plus people are on their radar screen. We also work, frankly, to give visibility to our candidates. So as an example, Aquila on NASDAQ every year have a list of the top 50 diverse candidates you've never heard of. So this year, I think that 7 LGBTQ plus people on that list, like we work with them to make sure that LGBT talent was visible. You know, I'm working now with Board Prospects, which in June launch a list of, every year makes a list of the 100 top LGBTQ plus people in the boardroom. You know, anything to make sure that the profile, that if someone calls a board member and say, do you know a CFO in the healthcare industry? We prefer for it to be a gay name than a straight name that comes up, right? So we want our candidates to have visibility. And then, you know, I think I had a huge discussion with John, which is that I focused a lot on publicly listed companies because I have data, because it's easy to focus on people that are completely at the top of business, right? The LGBT CEOs in retail, right? There's a lot of them. But I realized that the vast majority of boards are not public boards, and that the way those private boards seats are being filled is very different. And so, you know, that's why I was delighted to have an ally in John, is that it's a bit of a black box for me. And that's a bit my focus to understand more. So before I open the Q&A, I will tell you the association is still a bit of a mom and pop operation. You know, we are sponsored by JP Morgan. I think EY is coming on board. You know, recently Cohen hosted a dinner for us. You know, I'm trying to think about what is the pathway to make it a more sophisticated organization, like 30% Coalition for Women or the Latino Corporate Director Association. I have asked McKinsey if they would pro bono help us think about the future of the organization. I think one of the things which has been very comforting for me after 2 years is that there is a recognition that it's needed. You know, now we have data. We know we have 0.8% of board seats on Fortune 500. We know that we have 1.2% of board seats on NASDAQ. So we know that it's needed. We know that there is huge bottlenecks to fair representation. And so, you know, that proof of concept is very reassuring. You know, my dream is for it to become a sophisticated organization and for me to switch to go to the board, find a different executive director and hope that I made, with the help of my board member, a tiny difference in which I will end on is very related to what I did in the past at the United Nations and the World Bank. Is what I think is that ultimately, when LGBTQ plus people are in the room, they have a chance at improving their livelihood. And the vast majority of LGBTQ plus people in the world are living horrendous lives with no dignity, no economic opportunity. And when we have a chance to contribute, when we have a chance to participate in very important forums like the economy, ultimately that makes us closer to our goal. Exactly the same goals than straight people, which is living a life of happiness and joy. And so I love to say that it's not a complete mission creep for me. It does have a link to what I did at the UN and the World Bank in the past. And on that note, I'll end my monologue, and I would love to hear from you.
Tayar, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. You have a question, so please unmute.
Yes. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Tahar, and I'm reaching you from San Diego, so I'm driving. Thank you so much for highlighting the elephant in the room when it comes to diversity. And I'm grateful that you even mentioned the color. Being a triple threat, Hispanic, Black, LGBT, all of those things, in the US specifically, where some of that initiatives are being shifted in the opposite direction of progress, from the federal government down to the state level, which companies have an ear to. Their hands is on the pulse of what's going to hurt my business. Like Florida, for example, I just left a big client there, and I can already see the shift. And some of the willingness and openness to go, where I was a poster child, or my company was a poster child, you can kind of see folks slowly backing off. And if that's happening at the business level, it's definitely possibly happening at the board level. How can we articulate that, or strategically position ourselves to get it done using different language, using different tactics? Because I don't think the same tactics will work today moving forward for now. I'm curious, what would be a different strategy or approach?
Well, Taya, I have to say I love everything about what you said, right? First of all, on the triple threat, that's something that we are witnessing all the time, I discovered a lot in that process. One of the things that struck me the most is that, gay men have benefited the most from progress. And I joke that every 30-year-old called me, every 30-year-old gay man in New York called me and said I should be on the board of Target, while lesbians that were at the top of business were like, I don't know, I'm lucky to be there. I don't know if I have the qualifications. And meaning that, it's very visible how, the first to benefit are, of course, white men, right? And then it kind of trickles down. But in fact, yeah, you're right. If you are someone like Heather, with non-binary, Black, Latina, you're probably facing more of an uphill battle. And one of the things that the association does is that we do, as an example, a dinner for women every year. And the reason is because we think that women have specific challenges that sometimes men don't have in accessing the boardroom. Then, on your question about the backlash on DEI, I'll tell you, I have a newsletter that comes out every Wednesday, and on Substack. And at the beginning, a few months ago, I was making fun of the backlash on diversity, being like, oh, this is just a fad. And now I'm not laughing at all. I just had dinner I just had lunch with a woman that worked for a big bank, and she said, don't worry. The only thing we did is that we changed the title of our chief DI officer to chief talent officer. And I was like, that worries me. That means that they are winning, that diversity is becoming a bad word. Which crazy world do we live in? The diversity is seen as a leftist mission. Who doesn't like diversity? You would have to be crazy to think there is no value in diversity. And so in the US lately, conservative narratives takes hold in a way that baffles me. You know what I mean? Since when did the word woke become an insult? What is insulting about being awake? What it means, frankly, is that conservative narrative takes hold very quickly. Now, I'll tell you, I'm a little less worried about the boardroom, and I'll tell you why. Because we are never saying you should take that candidate because she's a woman and she's Black. What we are always saying is we happen to have this amazing professional that is not on your radar screen. Why don't you put her on your slate and interview her? And by the way, she happens to be Black and LGBT, so you will send a message to your investors that your board is not completely homogeneous. So I love to say that my strategy is not to beg straight people for board seats we don't deserve. My strategy is to make sure that we organize ourselves so that the talent is visible. And one day people wake up and will see that there is 7% LGBT representation in the boardroom, and they will be like, how did they get there? How did they manage to do that? They won't even see it happen, right? So what I mean is that I don't really rely on appetite for diversity, which, by the way, doesn't really exist. I rely on us organizing ourselves so that when someone gets a call for a CFO, it's one of our names rather than the name of someone from the dominating group in the boardroom.
Fabrice, I have a question. So your organization, which I want to join, you've expressed that you want to promote LGBTQ candidates for board memberships. But it seems that individuals in the LGBT community need training and development in order to be board members. My experience as a member of the LGBT community is I must work harder, have more degrees, more certifications than other people. And in fact, two law firms have told me the only reason they tolerated me is I had special knowledge that no other lawyer had. And one of my other customers told me we would normally get rid of you, but you have special knowledge. So the lesson I learned is I had to work harder and be smarter to function. And I believe that's the notion in all minority communities. So my question is, does your association help develop and train people for board membership when they are not existing board members? NACD is prohibitively expensive for many people. So I'm a member of organizations that do develop board members at lower cost. But I'm curious what you do. And by the way, I owe you a white paper, and I will be working on thought leadership in this area. And I do want to promote private board membership. Private boards are the growth engine of the United States. We outsource innovation to privately held companies through the private equity and venture capital system. So I believe they are a route to public board membership. But I do want to address that question, Fabrice.
Well, look, I'm going to say something that is probably a little controversial, right?
Please do.
I'm going to say that when my members take the NACD accreditation, they usually say, well, it was interesting. It was very interesting. I learned a little bit. But it's never like, oh, my knowledge was multiplied by 30, right? The issue with the boardroom, to be perfectly honest, is that it's not always rocket science. It's a little bit like everything, when there is something valuable, people will try to make you think that you cannot do it, to try to create this very high barrier. I have a friend that say the boardroom is one of these clubs that as soon as you get in, you try to close the door behind yourself, which is a horrible thing to say. But unfortunately, it's a little bit of a reality, is that, every time there is something a little bit valuable, people will build those very high walls to make sure that other people do not get in. It's probably a tragic aspect of humankind. What I mean by that is that if you are a member of an underrepresented group in America, and you manage to make it to the top of business, chances are you're more qualified than many people that are in the boardroom today. One of my friends who worked in private equity told me one day, he said, look, I would go to those meetings, nobody had read the board packet, and nobody would have any question. They had just come to get their remuneration, sit there, and then go home, and do the dinner before. And I say, that's why they love my candidates, because my candidates are crazy. They are type A overachiever that have made gigantic sacrifice to get to that level of business, so that they could say to their mom, look, mom, I managed to make it. Despite what everything said about gay people, I managed to make it to the top of business. So I'm caricaturing a little bit, but I can tell you that my candidates read the board package from cover to bottom. So this being said, what I mean by that is that I do believe that they have huge contribution to make to the boardroom, and I do believe that they tend to be overachiever type A that will take it very seriously. So it's a little bit gimmicky to say that. I agree that you have also to have a certain vocabulary. You have a certain way to create the narrative about yourself. You have to push, some of your skills that maybe you are not really thinking about, like cybersecurity. Maybe you have cybersecurity skills that you have never been able to articulate, and it's time for you to articulate them in the interview process. But what I mean by that is that very often when you take an accreditation, the only thing you do is you try to play into the narrative of, look, I am qualified. And it's not a bad idea. If that will get you in the boardroom, I think it's good. So I would actually love to be able to create cohort of LGBT people the same way African American are creating the black cohort at Santa Monica or I can't remember that, Santa Clara, right? There's a program at Santa Clara that equip African Americans to position themselves for the boardroom and then give them visibility. But it's pretty costly. We are not there. The budget of the organization is very small, so we are not there yet. To be honest with you, sometimes company will pay the fee for the African American executive to be part of the black cohort at Santa Clara. I don't see any company paying yet for their LGBT employees to get put in an LGBT cohort for the boardroom. We're not there yet, I think. But I agree with you, but I would like, I would also be on closed door. I would love to say, look, there's two ways to get in the boardroom. One is intentionality for minority, meaning you really have to work at it because it's difficult. You have an additional bottleneck to get in the boardroom. But I would say another aspect is posturing, which is that the way the dominant class takes position of power is by saying, I deserve it. I have a Yale degree. My father was an oil tycoon. I have a right to sit there. And we have to start behaving that way. And instead of excusing ourselves to getting there, to say, no, I have contributed to society. I have a right to sit there. And that's sometimes a bit difficult. That posturing aspect is so taboo that it's very difficult to talk to people about it.
Fabrice, we have two people with questions, Lynn and David. Lynn, could you give us your question, please?
Yes. Thank you, Fabrice. It's just such a pleasure to listen to you and your experience and your charm. There's one line that I loved, and I want to play it back because it was about the lost generation. It's a sad topic, but you said if you've died of HIV, you're out of luck in getting a board seat now. And I thought that was very funny. I wanted to raise something more, though, around. I have heard that board culture is like a street gang, right? It's very tight. It's very, it's kind of people like us. There's kind of a culture there, and I want you to get at for me. And I don't know whether it's there, but is there a thinking differently? Like it's almost at the beginning where you talked about the intersectionality of development and then this kind of work. And I'm wondering if beyond sort of the fair representation and beyond sort of the putting sort of the matters of equity on the table, is there some kind of angle or dimensionality or perspective or lived experience which actually is needed at the board table in terms of board decision making? And can you reflect a bit on that aspect? Thank you.
Well, I love that, which I think I have tried to articulate for a very long time, that LGBTQ plus people will have a different outlook on the world, right? Because we have an extremely unique experience, which is the experience of being born in a family where we had to hide something essential about ourselves. No other minority has that experience of having to lie to your teacher, having to lie to your parents, having to lie to your priest, and then that long road back to honesty, right? So I think that creates a completely different lens around the world. I also think, and that's not based on science, but I do think that as a gay man, I'm a gay man that has had to adapt a lot to homophobia, meaning, I made intentionally my voice being deeper than it was. I changed my handwriting because my father felt it was too feminine. So I think a lot of my true nature has been a bit diverted. But I do think that I am not exactly like a straight man. That the way I perceive the world, the way I interact with the world is different. I'm not saying that I have feminine qualities that are mixed with masculine quality, but I can see how sometimes my outlook is different than that of a woman and different than that of a man, but it's extremely difficult to encapsulate. But I think it's essential that because very often the argument that people will say, well, look, you bring an LGBTQ plus person in your board, they are going to help you navigate a demographic shift that is happening. And that's true, meaning that today, I think an incredible number of young consumers identify as LGBTQ plus. There's a huge number of young people that identify as non-binary. And they're not going to buy a car the same way than straight people did 30 years ago. You know, Ford is going to have to adapt. But I think that's not the real argument. The real argument is that we are part of humanity and bring a different lens. And I don't know if it's because of the way we are raised, or if it's because of biology, or if it's because of the experience of discrimination. But I'm convinced that we bring something to the conversation that is unique. But I have never been able to encapsulate it.
I'd like to recognize David's question. And David, can you tell us how to pronounce your family name, Mugenyi? I don't know if I'm pronouncing correctly.
Mugenyi is fine. That's perfect. Thank you very much. It's a kind of a parallel question and an observation from my experience. I wanted you to try and talk to Fabrice, and I think you probably have covered a lot of this ground already. But I was talking to one organization about what it took to be on the board. And I work in the finance function, right? I'm an accountant by trade. And they said to me, and this is a 500 million turnover business. And they said, David, the board are looking for people who can take it to the next level. They're looking for somebody who can take it to $1 billion. And I thought, oh, that's interesting, because in my background, I've worked for $2 billion organizations, and that was my own responsibility and accountability area. So I'm like, this is kind of a step down for me, right? This is a kind of a, I know this neighborhood really well. And it made me think, and you've touched upon this a lot in your conversation here, is rather than being LGBTQ focused, what does it take to be on a board, right? I'm sure straight white males have trouble getting on board. So what are boards looking for in people? And is that something that we just simply don't have? Or are they really putting that kind of barrier and say, yeah, you've got the experience, you've got the exposure, you've got the industry knowledge, but the LGBTQ thing then becomes a factor, right? I'm just wondering, have we got all the other attributes of what people are looking for boards, or are we missing like the right educational background? I live in Asia, right? So I'm in really deep waters here, right? I'm even non-racially, gendered with the current, with my own neighbors as well.
Well, look, I'll be super honest with you, right? Very often, boards would say, I would like a CFO that is going to chair the audit committee. I would like a CEO that is going to help take the business to the next level, right? And that's true. They want people that have P&L experience, that are going to help make more money, right? This being said, one of my members, who was the dean of a university, is on the board of Coned, which is an electrical company, and he did his thesis on James Baldwin. It's very difficult to make a link between James Baldwin and renewable energies. This being said, he's a brilliant guy that managed a huge university, and they love him. One time I sat next to the CEO of Coned, and he told me how much they love it, how much he's contributing. Recently, I asked Darren Walker, who is probably the most famous gay person on board. He's on the board of PepsiCo, he's on the board of Bloomberg, he's on the board of Ralph Lauren, which, by the way, is a board I recommend to anybody if you want to be well-dressed. Because he's dressed head to toe to them. And, he spoke and he said, I am the voice of social justice on those boards. And I was baffled, I thought that the reason he was on this board is because the Ford Foundation, you're managing billions of dollars. But he said, I'm on this board because I'm the voice of social justice. Mm-hmm. And that was brilliant to me, meaning that what I think is that ultimately what you need on the board is people that are brilliant, that ask the right question, that are smart, that can read a balance sheet, that can scan what is happening in the universe, and instead of thinking 3 years from now, think 20 years from now. So what I mean is that it comes back to that question of posturing, right? Which is you have to tell people that you have P&L experience, and that maybe you can serve on the audit committee, because they're always looking for someone on the audit committee. But ultimately, when you are going to be on the board, your contribution is that you are someone who is thoughtful, you are someone that can work with others, you are someone that is strategic, you are someone that can ask the right question, you are someone that takes your responsibility seriously. And that's not rocket science. But of course, people will make it. I have a recruiter. I asked him to have a conversation with one of my members, and he says, I only speak to 4-star generals and Fortune 100 CEOs. And I was like, well, that's pretty much a recipe to make sure that your company is going to do the same thing over and over again. you'd be much better off bringing a reality TV star on your board that is going to disrupt, the way the conversation is going. So, my thing would be, of course, there is a little bit of posturing, and of course, you should always show that you have the cybersecurity skills. Nobody is going to ask you to buy the software to protect the company. They are going to ask you to ask the right question from the CEO or from the chief technology officer when he comes in the room. So you don't really need to have cybersecurity skills. You don't really need to be someone that buys software. You need to be someone that thinks strategically, look at what's happening in the ecosystem. I'm saying that I'm a civil servant, right? I'm looking at it from the outside. But my conclusion behind closed door, what I tell people all the time is that it's about intentionality and it's about posturing. And if you are an LGBT people at the top of business, chances you are going to be much more brilliant than most of the people that are already in the boardroom. I'm not sure I would say that to the Wall Street Journal, but that, between us, that's the way I feel.
I do want to note we are over time and we'll have to end soon. I want to, so we can go about 5 more minutes. Fabrice, I sense there is much more to explore here. So I'm proactively inviting you to give another webinar in the future and we can talk. I also will write a white paper for your organization on the strategy of using private boards, and I have a lot of background in that. And I invite everyone to connect with me if you're interested in board careers. I've spent the past 5 years studying corporate governance, fiduciary duties, and I can share my knowledge with you and organizations that you might consider, executive education as well. We at the Bonner Institute also have programs on purposeful leadership for boards. We work with a lot of boards, helping them prepare for an IPO. And I'd also like to ask each of you to consider giving a webinar at the Bonner Institute. If you have a topic that is of interest to the C-suite or boards of directors, members of boards of directors, we're interested in inviting you. I want to thank every one of you for joining us today. I know there is a lot of talent in this group, and I look forward to being in touch in the future. So I'm going to look at the chat. So I will, just to let you know, I will send out Fabrice's information. I have all of your email addresses. I will send a little summary to all the email addresses of the individual. Oh, Fabrice just sent his Substack, so I will
and
send
my email, and
Oh,
don't
yes,
hesitate
thank
to
you.
reach out
Thank
to
you,
me.
Fabrice. Thank you. And I will send out a little meeting summary. I do want to note that I am very personally affected by all of this because I grew up in the age of AIDS. And when I volunteered to help the AIDS community, I was ostracized in the business community merely because I volunteered to help people with AIDS. And I have experienced physical violence for being perceived as gay. I've been demoted for being gay. I've been fired for being gay, and I've been not hired for being gay. And I've had to fight all my life for any success, despite 3 academic degrees and many certifications. So this is an issue of personal significance to me. And I also care about the intersectionality. I grew up in the very deep South, and I witnessed discrimination on the basis of race and gender in many business settings, and I want to do something about it. So I invite this community to stay in contact. Thank you very much, every one of you, for connecting today.